you. Thank you, Luke, for the introduction. Actually, there's not really a lot of room here to walk around, so I'll stay at the podium. So as I was putting this talk together, I was inspired by a couple of things that have happened over the past few months. First was a paper, actually, that Mike Stapleton sent to me that came out in Nature a few months ago. It was called AI and the Democratization of Knowledge. And fascinating article, and I will share some of the thoughts that were in that today as part of the overall conversation. And the other inspiration also was just the idea that as we've been traveling the globe, talking to a lot of different companies, large and small, about CMC and digitalization, all of the kind of, I would say, interest and maybe anxiety around AI, right? How do we deploy it? What should we do with it, right? We got to do something. There's always this, we got to do something with it, right? And so, but not really sure what to do. And so those two kind of came together in my head to kind of put this talk together. And the idea here is actually to be a little bit prescriptive, right? A lot of times I think people say, well, you could do this, you could do that. Sure, there's 10 different things you could do, but maybe what should you do, right? And so I wanted to put together a set of ideas as a recommendation because that's the way to challenge the thinking, right? Do you agree? Do you not agree? You can look at this and go, this is totally wrong. No, we don't agree. Here's why, or love it, whatever, right? So let's have that conversation. And if you've heard some of my presentations before, I like to start with this slide a lot because it helps frame the problem in the CMC data world. We have tons of data, right? We've got product data and process data and requirements and definitions and resources, materials and equipment, components, you name it, on and on, risk assessments, right? All of this stuff, and what do? We do that. That's what the industry does, right? And we all know it. Everybody knows that this is what happens. And of course, the challenge is that there's a lot of data here. Maybe there's some information when you wrap context around it in a report, but where's the knowledge, right? This information isn't really integrated. And without it being integrated, there's not a lot of knowledge, right? Institutional knowledge is kind of absent. So if a critical material is going to change, right, you don't have an idea very easily of how it impacts a CQA, right? Or how it impacts tech transfer. You have to sit down, have meetings, look at reports, right? And it goes on and on. So taking a step back, I think one of the questions is, well, what's the difference between data and info and knowledge and intelligence, right? And so, I wanted to walk through a CMC example, right? Because this conversation happens a lot. So let's say I come to you and I say, hey, I've got pH readings off of 4 batches for a drug substance intermediate after production culture. And you look at that and you go, okay, that's cool, right? I mean, you can't really interpret much about that data except that well, it looks like it's trending a little bit higher as we've been executing the batches. And, okay, it looks reasonable, but that's all if I give you that information, right? Or I give you that data. Now, if I put some limits around it, you have a little bit more context, right? So now you look at it and you go, oh, well, those are the limits, and looks like that last one is out of specification, right? Okay. At this point, you may go, oh, well, there's a deviation here. We should try to figure out what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And then you start all this root cause analysis, right? Well, you may do that, or you may go, well, we don't know, right? We got to first say, well, what does this even mean? What does pH mean overall, right? You don't have context into what it means into the broader scheme of things, right? So maybe in the knowledge world, you say, well, somebody comes in and says, well, pH is a controlled process parameter. During the production culture unit operation, it is a CPP because it impacts aggregation, which is a CQA. Right now you're starting to get some context around, okay, well, this thing is out of spec and it's important, right? Great. Next layer, intelligence, right? Now you may come and say, well, wait a minute. SME comes and says, hey, these spec limits aren't actually correct. We have modeled pH across multiple programs using DOEs to properly characterize the design space for pH, right? You need visibility across all your programs for that intelligence, right? So this is ultimately the challenge, right? We spend a lot of time walking through this conversation anytime something like this happens, because this information's not, and knowledge and intelligence isn't readily available for us as an organization when this happens. And then, of course, all this information, again, it's PDF batch records, maybe they're electronic. You got specs in another document. The CQA analysis is in the QTPP, right? And the intelligence is probably tacit knowledge, right? Some SME knows that they've done all this work over the past few years, and it's all in his head or her head, right? So, and you know, this is sort of what the data to knowledge conversion looks like today, right? It's not unfamiliar to anybody. A lot of unstructured data. Some of the data that's in ELN and LIMS is partially structured, right? Not necessarily fully structured. You spend a lot of time tracing the source data, doing cleanup, verification. Then you run them into data hubs and data lakes, right? And then you're building dashboards, more reports, back into documents, and then into SharePoint or QMS. So you go documents to documents, right? That's what we do. So another construct is the data to knowledge pyramid, right? We generate, again, tons of data, lots of observations, right? All that stuff's going into ELN and LIMS. But then we get stuck in the information layer, right? And why? Because you see on the side there that as you go up the pyramid, it's more and more work, right? And people just are like, you know what? I don't have time for that work. I'm just going to generate my data, I'll stick it somewhere, and we'll deal with it later, right? So what does dealing with it later look like? Looks like that. So if you think about what we do across the life cycle, right? We don't deal with the data. The effort is lower in the earlier stages, and then we end up putting a lot of effort in the later stages to pull all this information together to get our tech transfers done, to get our regulatory submissions put together. And of course, that's when you start seeing all the gaps. Oh, we don't have this. We didn't do this, right? Now you got to go back and retrospectively fill those holes or come up with a creative argument as to why you don't have that information, right? So we sacrifice effort today, all right? Or we don't do the effort today, make the investment today, and we end up making a lot of effort and investment later on, which isn't an efficient way to operate. Especially if you think about if you're a platform company, right? Why not do that work up front and then just reuse that knowledge over and over again? So unstructured data increases costs and risks, as we all know. I mean, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, 70 to 80% of manufacturing data remains unstructured today. Now, that percentage is probably staying relatively fixed, but if you think about the amount of data we're generating, the absolute amount of unstructured data is just growing dramatically, right? Every day, every month, every year. And you know, you waste time, so FTE time's wasted searching, cleaning, right? You name it. Extended tech transfers, right? So a serial tech transfer usually takes at least 18 months today, right? So if you want to take your cycle times down, that's a good place to start, right? Get your tech transfer times down first, right? As a great way to as a sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will. And then of course, the regulatory risk around potential, you know, clinical holds with CMC deficiencies at IND. You know, now the PAI is added a fourth objective, right? What is your commitment to pharmaceutical quality in development? That's the term, right? So now inspectors are going to be looking for that, right? And trying to understand, did you get lucky with your 3 batches, or do you actually have robust process understanding so that you are, you know, you really understand what's happening, right? And it's not just that you got lucky. So this is the paper that I was mentioning. You know, how do you start to address this problem? And AI and the democratization of knowledge is the article that came out in the Nature paper. And this diagram's in there where they're basically saying, look, at the bottom here, this is what we do, right? We produce data in individual labs, expertise dependent, you know, implicit background knowledge, and it's limited value for reuse because we take it, we put it in an Excel spreadsheet, or it's in a LIMS record somewhere, right? And it's not easily accessible as part of a broader knowledge base, right? So the idea here is that democratization and data of knowledge starts through standardization and curation, right? There has to be at somewhere along the line you're gonna do this. Just a question of where you're gonna do it. Where are you gonna take all this information and start to standardize it and curate it so then it becomes part of a knowledge base, right, that can be reused, right? And it can be deployed in AI and a variety of other things, right? Building that institutional knowledge. So the example they give in the paper is the work that was done to create AlphaFold, right? The AI engine that predicts protein structure, right? So, you know, there's a lot of data. So there's a lot of data that they harnessed, right? And then they built these knowledge models. Now, how many people think that what they actually did was they trained the AI on the data to get the knowledge model? Okay, good, because that's not what they did, right? They took that data, right, and then they built it into standardized, curated models of 3D protein structure, and then they trained the AI algorithm on the knowledge models, right? It's very different than what everybody's trying to do today, and they're trying to say, oh, dump a bunch of data into it and train the AI on the data, and it'll figure out the curation and the standardization for us. And no, it won't. It won't do that, right? So, so it's a very interesting point that they raised, that the way they did this in discovery was to harness all the data that's out there, X-ray diffraction patterns, magnetic resonance spectra, all the things that they use in that world, right? And what they did is they first created a structure. So the protein data bank said, okay, we're gonna create a file structure, right, that's standardized, right, that's also extensible, because we know we're not gonna get it all right in the beginning, right? And we're gonna define that as that's where data goes, right? Then they worked with experimentalists to make sure that as data is being put in the protein data bank, there's not junk going in there, right? And so that created structure and curation, right? And then they took those, they took those models, and then they trained AI on that to come up with AlphaFold. And now it's AlphaFold 3, right? So we'll come back to that in a little bit here, but so you're right. So, you know, what they trained on was the knowledge, not the data. So if we want to take this same approach for CMC, right? Well, first we have to start with going digital, right? I mean, we live in a world that's a lot of paper, and if it's not paper, it's electronic, but electronic is simply paper on glass for the most part, right? And what has to happen is that we have to go digital, and that means taking all that information and breaking it apart into atomic nodes of data, right? So as you break it apart, then each individual piece of data or information becomes separately addressable. And then you can link it, right? And those connections that you make as relational connections or relational databases is how you you need that as a precursor to be able to do any of this other work that you really want to do. So if you're gonna start to structure this information, well, what should be the structure, right? And I think we're seeing more and more that people are moving towards these principles of structure, right, which is the FAIR principles. So if you're going to create a structure, you're gonna create a solution, a platform, a tool, whatever, right, it should follow these principles, right? So that the information should be easily findable, right? It should have rich, consistent metadata around this information, right? It should be accessible, so you can easily find it and know that, you know, this pH means this, it doesn't mean that. So it should have unique identifiers, right? It should be interoperable, right? So, you know, whatever platform I'm using, I should be able to interact with other systems. And this is the point that Luke was making, that no one solution is going to solve this problem, right? It needs to be an ecosystem of solutions, and that means that they have to work together. And finally, you want structures that are reusable, right? So the idea of building templates, right? Having record structures, right, that you can reuse, especially if you're doing platform-based work. So if you're in the mRNA space or you're in the mAb space or whatever, and you have a platform technology, do 80 or 90% of that work up front once and then reuse it, and you're really doing the other 10 to 20% every time instead of the full amount every time. So those are the principles of structure. But then what should the actual taxonomies and ontologies be for our industry? What's actually relevant to the domain? Because that's what reusability requires, right? And so if you think about all of these and you have a variety of different taxonomies and ontologies out there, right, what should you use? And the interesting thing is that everybody's trying to find one. And our argument is that, well, there's actually a hierarchy, right? Our perspective is that there isn't one, but you start maybe with a foundational one that spans the life cycle, right? Things like quality by design, GXP, ISO 14971 risk management, data integrity. These are all the things that have to be done across the life cycle, right? Then if you think about ICH, well, that's built on top of these, right? So Q8 spouses the principles of quality by design, right? Q9, ISO 14971, right? So they're actually built on top of these. Then you start getting into sort of segmented, right? When you're in the preclinical world, maybe you're GLP, right? Then you go into the clinical world, now you're GMP, right? Then you have phases of development, right? So the people in process development and characterization use different words and languages than the people in manufacturing, right? They don't care about ISA 88 and ISA 95 back in early PD, right? And then finally you have the regulatory pieces, right? So, at the IND you've got ECTD, right? But as some of the structures like IDMP and PQCMC, which is sort of the database that the FDA is thinking about for their structured applications, right? These are going to start to pop up at the different regulatory phases as well. So it's not one, right? You have to think about being able to have foundational ones that you can then translate. And so then the question is, well, do LLMs come to the rescue, right? Well, can we just take all our documents and let ChatGPT have at it, and it'll just do the work for us, right? Except it won't, right? LLMs achieve strong performance on many tasks. Very good at NLP, reading comprehension, translation, question answering, on-the-fly reasoning, domain adaptation, so on and so forth. But one of the big challenges with LLMs is that noisy data really affects performance, right? And when these algorithms have been trained on all kinds of real-world data, right? So how do you know that it's not well curated for CMC, right? It turns out it's not well curated for CMC, right? And actually there's many business use cases where, I think that last bullet point is important, that reliable outputs for a particular business use case often requires additional training on actual data from this domain labeled with the desired outputs. Structure your data with how you want it to come out, right? Train on that information and you're going to get much better results, right? And this is another little study where it was a simple classification task for whether language was polite or not in different languages. And what they found was that as you fixed the noise in the data, right, you got much better performance in the accuracy of the model. So the idea here really is that if you want to use LLMs, right, you need to get rid of the noise first. That means some form of cleaning, curating to do that. And then you're going to be able to do a better job of starting to harness LLMs to maybe do some of this translation into a structured format, right? That you can then, into a knowledge model that you can then train your AI algorithms on. So can you start to fine tune the structure, right? So if I've got a document with a lot of information in it, right? If I've got a QTPP document that's got a ton of information in it, if I start to digitize it into a structured format, right? That's a process of curating, it's a process of standardizing, it's a process of reducing the noise, right? And then you can then take any structured format and translate it into another one that's meaningful for whatever phase of development you're in, right? So if I have a language that everybody understands, right, I can take French and translate it into English because I understand the rules of how French work and understand the rules of how English work, right? And so having it in one language that we all understand and is standardized makes it easy for us to go to another language. So we can go from GLP to GMP, or we can go from process development into characterization, or then into manufacturing, right? Because we've done this. Now, there's another important point here, and that is that you want to start building contextualization, right? That's really important. So that whole data, information, knowledge, intelligence progression that I went through is a form. It's demonstrating how data becomes richly contextualized, right? And so, for us at QbDVision, we started obviously with a set of technologies, building a cloud-based solution, building a structured data framework based on ICH and QBD principles, deploying other technologies to create a structured data framework where you're now atomizing the data, you're indexing the content inside the documents. You're no longer indexing documents, but the content inside the documents. You're contextualizing with relevant taxonomies and ontologies. The contextualization layer now is things like, hey, you can do requirements management with quality risk management. You can build your process. You can have objects, libraries, and templates. You can automate report generation and so on and so forth. And then your knowledge layer really becomes, okay, we've got these automated workflows of digital product and process management, right? We've got digital resource management, so our materials, our equipment, right? Being able to know that, hey, this material is used in these 10 projects, right? So if you get a vendor change notification that, hey, this material is going to be discontinued or it's going to change, Mark, how long does it take you to find out how many different programs it's affecting? Right?
Depends
It's just
on how good the data I have in the reference.
exactly right. So everybody's been through that challenge, right? And so taking technology, structure, contextualization to knowledge, we're building the knowledge models, right? So you can kind of start to see the analogous trajectory that we're following here with AlphaFold. So now you're building an integrated model, right? These things are all connected. So if a material changes, I can see all the programs it impacts. I know which material attributes are in each of those programs. I can see what their risk assessments are related to CQAs. Immediately I know how does material change impact all the CQAs of all my programs, right? So what does this start to look like, right? Like you put all this together. So here's one example where, if you're users of QbDVision, you've seen our risk map. Right here we're showing you a knowledge graph. Aggregation is the key CQA, right? We can immediately see, based on the risk-based model, what are all the parameters in the production culture unit operation that impact aggregation. It's color-coded by risk, so things that are red and orange are high risk. Things that are green you probably shouldn't worry about, right? This is a visualization of the knowledge, right? Because it includes risk, relationships, right? All of it. Another one is a control strategy map, right? So this is just a simple formulation fill finish process. Sterility is the CQA you're keying on. You've overlaid the control strategy labels that say, oh, well, release testing and in-process testing for sterility, and you can start to trace it back. You trace it back to bioburden, which is an in-process test. And oh, by the way, it's telling you that, in this case, you've layered in batch data too, that this is not particularly in control because the CPK is less than 1. Right? That's a lot of layers of information coming together that would typically take a lot of meetings and sorting through of data and stuff to figure that out. Being able to pull all that up in one map is how you're really demonstrating that your system is deploying knowledge, right? So let's go back to the protein structure conversation, right? You've got a bunch of data. They took that data, they put it into domain-relevant structured framework. They built knowledge models based on that. Then they trained AI on those to get the AlphaFold algorithm, right? What does that look like for CMC possibly, right? So you had a bunch of data. You got, experiment data, stability data, DOEs, all kinds of stuff, right? You got specs, you got requirements, everything. Put that into a structured framework. And I think what's interesting here is now you think about taking that and now building digital twins, right? Your digital twins are your simulation models, right? That you could start to put together based on the data and the structured framework, right? Which then becomes your digital knowledge model for manufacturing. And now you train AI on those digital knowledge models, right? To get to whatever you want to call it, CMC, fold, I don't know, right? But, you get to prediction capabilities by taking the same approach. Now, I'm not saying any of this is easy, because even the top layer was not easy, right? But I think the path is very similar. And that's really how you're going to get the value out of AI, because then what you're saying is once you have a predictive digital manufacturing model, now you can put, okay, well, this is what we're doing. Give me the best 2 or 3 scenarios for meeting all my objectives, right? Now, there's stuff that's happening out there right now in this world, but a lot of it still is very focused on, I need to optimize yield, right? It's very performance-based, right? But if you say, no, I need to optimize yield while I also need to make sure all my CQAs stay in spec, right? You've created a much higher dimensional problem, right? Which they're not tackling yet, right? Or not, it's not a mainstream thing yet, right? So I think this is what we're kind of saying is a potential analogous path to the protein structure model for getting to a CMC predictive model using an AI approach. What are we doing along these lines? Well, we've built the data structure using FAIR principles. There's a lot of, there's a lot of knowledge, especially for legacy programs, trapped in documents and obviously tacit knowledge in people's brains. So we're now starting to work on using Gen AI to fine-tune, right, this information, because there's a lot of noise in this information, right? And so you can manually sit there and go through all this, but obviously there's efficiencies to be gained by leveraging Gen AI. So we're starting to look at how to do that. So now you're creating that standardized and curated model of information, right? And we have, we have our document engine to put it back out into documents because that's still what people want right now. And using Gen AI, I think, is the next step in order helping to do that, right? So create even more efficiencies with using Gen AI to output, right? But ultimately, you want to incorporate the digital twin process in here as well too, right? So now if you have structured data format, going back here, oops, if we're here now being able to feed digital twins to start building those AI models that you can then train your AI algorithms on is what's next. Going back to this, what do you do about this, right? Well, it's going to require change management. There's just no getting around that, right? I mean, it's a behavior change, right? Organizations have to. I mean, you will never realize the potential of AI if you don't get from data to information to knowledge. You will dance around the periphery of it, right? So you want to dance around the edge of the dance floor, you can do that all day long, but at some point you have to get into the dance floor, and that's going up this stack, right? And so what does that mean, right? Like, so how do we think about change? People talk a lot about technology, content, process, people. But the challenge with that is that you end up with this sort of J curve, right? Where you're putting all your eggs in the basket at one time, right? And that's typically not how change management is most effective, right? Because what always happens here is you get to this is the trough of disillusionment, right? And you end up down there and you go, you know what? This sucks. Forget about it. It was better. This wasn't as bad as this is. And you don't even know what this is, right? You never get there, right? So agility, an agile mentality is going to be much better. Take it in bite-sized chunks, right? Starts with people driven by a regulatory or business purpose, right? You define an outcome. You then find the technology or use existing technology to solve that problem. Adjust your business process, and you do this over and over again, right? And so that's really what the J curve actually should look like, because you want to realize those value propositions along the way. Otherwise, you get stuck in that trough of disillusionment. So those are our thoughts. Love to hear feedback, any questions. It's not like I said, it's not something you're gonna do tomorrow, but I think from our perspective, it at least provides a sense of what that path should look like, and how all the different things that are happening come together to maybe do this. Yes.
So, do you have any recommendations around? Okay. Do you have any recommendations around allaying security concerns when it comes to feeding sensitive documents to generative AI?
Yeah, well, I think more and more now you're hearing that you can take whatever model of AI it is and just deploy it for your organization, right? And then I think the idea there is that you get the benefit of what it's already learned, but then you fine tune it with your business information within your implementation of it. And I think then it's not going out to the public, essentially. Obviously, there's also the question of how secure is the translation, or as information is being sent to whatever servers to do the processing or the prediction that you get information back. I think I don't know the answers to that. I think our CTO would probably be able to answer that better. But Dan.
So we actually just finished doing some research on Gen AI and life sciences, and one of the key things is you need to have a policy, just like with any other technology. When you went off-prem with your servers, you needed to have a policy. When you went to the cloud with your data, you needed to have a policy. So it's really applying the same approaches that we've used to other tools, because AI is a tool, not a strategy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? And seeing how can we, yes, there are issues. You should not upload your proprietary information into ChatGPT in the cloud.
Yeah, so that's the public instantiation of it, right? But I think if you're going to deploy this, for your enterprise,
Exactly.
I think all of them, so we use a version of ChatGPT that's in Azure, right? But it's our instance of it, right? So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Ronak.
Pass that down.
The chart you saw is more like a journey, right? It's not that, oh yeah, overnight you can flip it and everything you achieve. So in your experience, what do you think it's, how long is that journey takes to go from paper to the digital tech transfer and that process overall?
Well, I mean, it depends on how much your organization is committing to, the particular activity, right? How many resources you're putting behind it. I mean, more and more we're seeing large enterprises recognizing that some sort of structured approach is required, right? It doesn't have to be our approach, but some sort of structured approach around CMC data. I think you're seen it in discovery, you've seen it in clinical. CMC has to be next, right? And so I think you're going to hear today from some of the folks who have done some work or are thinking about this, sort of how they think about it, what their specific journey is around that. And but what I was trying to lay out here is a little bit more from a principle perspective, right? What are the kind of key things that have to happen in order to ultimately realize the value of AI, which everybody wants to do, right? I mean, it's very exciting what's happening in the discovery world, right? And now that they don't just have this, but they can actually model all the interactions of every biological molecule, right? Now you're getting into some really interesting simulations that can potentially take the discovery part of the life cycle way down. We don't know that yet, right? But I think if you want to do the same for manufacturing, then I think I'm suggesting you follow that same trajectory that discovery has done, right? Yeah.
So I might ask a very naive question. So as a first step, right, to realize the digital CMC, right, you mentioned maybe like we need to have a structured data, right? So my question is like, how can you like make a unstructured data become structurable? So because I came from the cell therapy CMC, so cell therapy, as you know, might know, right, is very complicated. We are running like all kind of analytics with different methods, right? Data is format is really different. How can really like structure all these data sets? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a great question. I think what ultimately has to happen there has to be. So what happened in the discovery world was that there's a organization called the Protein Data Bank, and they kind of led. They're a nonprofit organization, I'm pretty sure, that led this process, right? And so we're having some conversations about, can you put together an organization of companies that can start to think about, from the CMC side, right? How do you create some level of standardization to drive this and curate, right? And the idea would be to not go build another new, all-encompassing taxonomy or ontology, but how can you think about that hierarchy, use what's already out there, right? And build a fair structure that you can then at least create some structure of data, then be able to translate between them. And I think that's going to have to be the same process, as they went through. So, yeah. We've taken the approach of saying, well, ultimately everything has to be translated back into the ICH world, because that's how you do your regulatory submission, right? But I think we'll hear from Vijay later. He's a big fan of IDMP, right? And so the question is, well, yeah, he's partially right, but they're partially right. Then you got FDA that's talking about PQCMC, right? So ultimately, trying to come up with one and reconcile all of them, I think, is futile. I think you pick one, and then you pick one for your own purposes, and then you're going to have to, translate it into the different ones as needed.
And I think that the point you brought up during your presentation is an excellent one. I mean, what is your language of record? Are you going to speak English or French or
yeah.
Chinese, and identify what is your language of record, but also be very thoughtful around how you're going to translate that. Because simply because I have the words, they don't translate.
Right.
It doesn't
Right.
mean the same thing, because the sentence structure is different and the grammar. So really it's about understanding how you're going to use it and how your customers, which include regulators for the data, are going to use it as well.
Yeah. But I think the challenge we have is a lot of people are saying, well, let's come up with a super language.
Let's do Esperanto.
Yeah, right. That will, a Chinese person, a French, they can all understand it, right? That's, stop doing that.
We tried it. They won't.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Let's give a big round of applause.